Thanks, Tara. All right, I'll give a brief introduction of myself for those of you who I don't know. I'm Ben Ruffenall. I work for WSP. I'm a water resource engineer. I've been doing floodplain mapping work for the state of Kansas for 17 years now. And I sit in our Topeka office. So for this workshop, here's a brief overview of what we'll be talking about. We'll be going over all of the letter of map change options here, all the different types of letter of map change, and how to apply for these and get through the process. So the MT1 application and MT2 applications, and talk about when you would use each different type of letter of map change and what situations you'd use those in. And we'll walk through a example of, or kind of walk through the process of one of these applications. And I'll give you the lessons we've learned on going through these applications over the years. So the goals of this workshop are to understand the different letter of map change processes, understand the MT1 and MT2 applications, and to get a little get lessons learned so you don't make the same mistakes that we've made over the years, and hopefully get through the processes a little quicker. Just the letter map change resources. So FEMA's got a lot of good help out there online. On their website, they have an actual help center that you can reach by phone, by email, or through live chat. And that is a good resource that I suggest any of you use if you have any questions at all about the process. They can get you squared away, and they will give you some good advice that will make the process go a lot smoother before just, making the mistakes and having to go through different reviews. The letter of map change website here listed here. This is kind of what it looks like. Hopefully this is up to date. I think it mostly looks like this now. They do change it fairly regularly. And we'll look at it later. We'll walk through the whole website later and show where to download the applications and the different parts of the website. And here's some of the help. The help website is listed there, and some of the resources, some of the type of stuff you'll see on that. There's a whole definitions of, who needs to do things, what types of letter of map change need to be done in different situations. And there's a whole lot of information. A lot of the information that I go over is all there on the website. So we'll go over the different types of letter of map change now, and when you would use each one. So what is a letter of map change in general? This is a letter that reflects an official revision or amendment to an effective flood insurance rate map. So these are any time that you have a structure that is in a floodplain that you don't think should be in the floodplain, or that survey shows is actually out of the floodplain, or if you actually are making a change, doing some construction within the floodplain and are altering what the floodplain would look like, or elevating the structure so that it won't be in the floodplain. These are where you would use a letter of map change. Anytime that you want a structure that is shown in the floodplain to actually be shown not shown in the floodplain. Although some of these amendments, they don't actually alter the maps. They'll just give you a certificate that says you are out and you do not need to purchase insurance. That's the difference between amendments would be those type, and then revisions are where we actually change the mapping. So when do we need to do this? So a lot of times especially on older maps, if you're still on paper maps, they're really outdated topography. So the mapping is not completely accurate to what the ground surface actually looks like. So structures are shown in when they're really not in, according to survey and the elevations listed on the map. And even on new good LiDAR data, the mapping scale, sometimes your actual building pad may be elevated and the map itself won't go to that level of detail. So you need a LOMA in that situation to show that you're actually out of the map. And then if you're doing any kind of construction, replacing a structure across the road that goes across the floodplain, if you're doing any kind of development within the floodplain, any type of floodplain fill, really any construction that happens in the floodway or floodplain. Or a project that causes the actual flood elevations to change. So we'll go over the 7 types of letter of map change: the letter of map amendment, conditional letter of map amendment, letter of map revision, letter of map revision based on fill, conditional letter of map revision, conditional based on fill, and physical map revision. So these are when you hear people talking about LOMA, CLOMA, LOMR, LOMR F, CLOMR, CLOMR F, these are what they actually stand for. So the first one, a letter of map amendment, LOMA. This is when the situation I'm talking about, when our topography is outdated, a structure is actually actually above the base flood elevation, but on the map it's shown as in the floodplain. This is where you get a survey done on the low adjacent grade of the structure and show that is above the base flood elevation, and you will use a LOMA to officially remove that structure from the floodplain, even though the map does not get changed in this situation, but the structure will have a certificate that says does not need flood insurance. It is out of flood danger, according to the 1% floodplain. And then a conditional letter of map amendment. So this is what you use. So conditional are the letter of map changes that you get before you do construction within the floodplain. This is to get pre-approval that what you're building will not be in the floodplain. So with a CLOMA, the only time this would really be used is if you're building a slab on grade structure that is actually above the floodplain. So you're not doing any fill, but you are building a new structure that is still above that base flood elevation, just because the topography wasn't at a good enough level to show that it was out. But if you do any fill at all for the construction, then this is not the correct way to go. This is for basically slab on grade only. Letter of map revision is modification to an actual floodplain. So if the flood boundary itself is going to change, you actually want to modify the floodplain. This is the way you want to go. And this is based on some actually changing the ground surface that will change the way water flows through an area. So it will change the resulting base flood elevations. And this will officially revise the flood insurance rate map. So this will, if you're building some sort of structure that is elevated, doing some fill, And this will actually show on the map that it is out of the floodplain. And if you actually make significant changes, if you're making changes to the profile of the stream, to the base flood elevations, and the flows through the stream, then you also need to update the flood insurance report, flood insurance study report, and provide the appropriate, you have to detail out what changes were made, what the flows, new flows were, new elevations, throw new profiles into the report. Conditional letter of map revision. So this is what you would use and what we generally suggest you use before you start a project. So this is where you will get your changes to the floodplain approved before you actually make the changes. This will ensure that your project is following all the FEMA rules before you go through and create a project that maybe doesn't meet the rules where you thought it would, and you end up having to make some expensive changes to your project after you've already constructed it. So this is a highly suggested to go through the LOMR process before going to a LOMR. And then a LOMR, you still have to go through the LOMR process. If you get a LOMR, you complete the construction, you still have to go through the LOMR process post-construction to actually get your map changed. But if you have followed everything that you said you would in the LOMR, then it should be a very smooth process. LOMR F, letter of map revision based on fill. If you are only building doing a structure where you're adding a little bit of fill and just making sure it's elevated out of the floodplain, but aren't actually changing any base flood elevations, nothing in the profile is changing, you aren't touching the floodway, then you can just do a LOMR F. And this will not change the flood insurance rate map. This is just like a LOMA, only you actually use some fill before you build your structure. So there is some floodplain fill. And LOMR F, same thing. You do this before you construct your structure to make sure that your structure will be compliant with all the FEMA rules before you actually go through the process of construction. So PMRs are usually a larger scale. So this is usually a kind of a community-wide change or a very significant change. An example of a PMR would be like if you build a levee or if you get a levee certified, that would significantly change the floodplain through a community. That would be a PMR instead of a LOMR. Where if we're going through multiple map panels of change and a large change in flood risk zones and floodplains and floodways, and this goes to the difference between a PMR and a LOMR is really just there's more due diligence required because of more people being impacted by the changes. A no-rise certification. So this is a certification that says that your project will not increase the 1% annual chance flood elevations anywhere in the floodplain. So you have a 0.00 foot rise within the 1% annual chance floodplain. So this is a full study. You have to do a full study on this where you have proposed conditions. You have your existing conditions model. You have your proposed conditions model. You show that there is zero change in the flood elevations between these two. And sometimes this will actually change the floodplain and sometimes it won't. So whether you need a LOMR to go along with it or not is dependent on that. So like if if a community is replacing a bridge structure, but it's not significantly changing it in any way that where it doesn't change any of the floodplain, then you need a no rise, but you don't necessarily need a LOMR for that because you're not actually changing any of the floodplains. But if you're changing the size of that and it does actually change some of the floodplain, but I guess you're no rise, so you have to keep you can't increase that elevation, but sometimes it does drop it. Or just move it around in some situations. If you change the alignment of your stream or something along those lines. So all those CLOMA, CLOMRF, CLOMARs are intended to just reduce the risk of you not following all the rules and having to make a change after construction has already been completed. So this is just to, before you even start the process, making sure you're doing everything correctly. This is, again, highly suggested. It's all, you're going through the same process that you are for the LOMA, LOMRF, LOMR, but you are just doing it before anything is built to make sure that it's going to meet all those requirements. Again, each one of these, you still need to go through the LOMA, LOMRF, LOMR process, file the application just like you would after the construction is completed. It's just that, you know, the review is going to go smoothly at that point. All right, so the different application types. So these different letter of map revisions here, or letter of map changes, have different application requirements. And this table kind of shows which ones need the MT1 and MT2 paperwork here, forms filled out. And there's also an MT Easy, which the MT Easy is a for licensed professionals only, where you can just go online and fill out a quick form. And this is for LOMAs only. But if you're a licensed surveyor or engineer, you can make a elevation determination and submit this very quick LOMA. Otherwise, so MT1 amendments are, MT1s are for amendments. So anything that doesn't actually change the map, it just certifies that a structure is out of the floodplain. The MT1 application is for those situations. So you can see LOMA, CLOMA, LOMRF, CLOMRF. And then anything that actually changes the flood insurance rate map goes to an MT2 revision. So LOMRs, CLOMRs, and PMRs will fall under that. So how do we start this process? So these can be submitted by paper or online. They do prefer that you do it online, and they have a lower cost for online applications to try to get you to do them online. There's the website for doing the, where you submit the online letter map change. And then the e-LOMA is that MT Easy. Well, I guess the LOMA, I guess I misspoke on that. The e-LOMA is for the licensed professionals. The MT Easy form is for just a quick form for LOMAs. But the e-LOMA is the one that licensed professionals can use to quickly, it's a very quick process. And then all the mail-in forms that you fill out are available at those locations. And we'll click through those when we go through our example later. So here's the costs for all these. This is for the MT1 application. So you see that e-LOMA is free when you're doing the licensed professional going through the process. And the single lot, single structure LOMAs are also free. The CLOMR Fs, and there you can see they go up in price from there. And you can see the price difference there between the paper form and online, trying to get you to go online for that. And then the MT2 applications are, of course, significantly more expensive. Although this fee is generally lower than the actual work that is needed to go through this process. So the engineering work behind it. And then you can see it's more expensive to do a CLOMR. CLOMRs are cheaper, but remember you also have to do the LOMR after the fact. So you pay the CLOMR fee and you still have to go through the LOMR process and pay the LOMR fee if you do that. So it is more expensive to go through the CLOMR process, but saving the $7,000, paying the $7,000 up front could save you significantly more than that in the back and doing the extra work after the construction. So how long does this process take? So of course the ELOMA, the licensed professional one, that's of course just take a few minutes to fill out the form, and they're pretty much always accepted. Most of those get accepted. The MT Easy, MT1 amendments will usually be accepted within 60 days of receipt. And then the MT2 forms, that process, so the LOMR process, because you have to go through due diligence, you have to go through the review process. This will take a minimum, if everything goes perfectly, it's 6 months. And of course, things rarely go perfectly. So if you go through multiple rounds of these 90-day review comments, that's of course gonna spread things out. Or if there's any appeals when you go through your due diligence and you have to show this to anyone that's impacted by these changes. If there's any appeals or any response to that, then that will also slow down the process. Again, I say this multiple times, use the FEMA help, online help. It's good. And they'll get you going in the right direction. If you have any doubts at all, might as well use the help. And now I think, Tara, you can do that second pull so we can get.
Okay, yeah, sounds good. Let me bring that up. All right, so this one is, what is your experience with letters of map change? I'll give you guys just a little more time. It looks like most of the responses are in. All right, I'll go ahead and end that and then share the results. So it looks like, many of you haven't completed one, and then some of you do have some experience with LOMAs or LOMRs. So, all right, thanks guys for filling that out.
Good to know the level of experience everybody has.
Yeah.
From instructor's perspective here. And if you have any questions throughout this whole thing, I'll try to watch the chat a little bit here. I can see that just somebody asked if we could share that table, and yeah, we'll share the slides, all the slides after this training. All right, so now we'll go over the MT1 application, where we can get it, what you need to, what's required to go along with this application. So the MT1 application, like I said before, is just for amendments, map amendments. So these are not going to be actual changes to the map. They're just going to tell you that you are above the base flood elevation. So this is for LOMAs, LOMRF, CLOMA, CLOMRF type applications. So these are usually just for individual structures. They can be for multiple structures, but say most of them are for just individual structures that want to be shown out of the floodplain. All right, there's the links to the forms. And like I said, we will share these, so you'll have all these links. Although a quick Google search will give you to these links as well. And I suppose I can actually click through one now. And show you where it takes you. So all of these links really take you to the same page and just a different level of the page. And then there's instructions and even a tutorial for completing on these. So like I said, the FEMA really tries to walk you through this process, does a good job, offers help. So take advantage of all that. And if you click through any one of these, you get the instructions, PDFs, and the actual form as a Word document. If we click through that, we get to our form. And this is the MT Easy form. So it is a very brief form. Try to walk through everything that's on here. Has fill been placed on your property? So right here, first question, they're making sure that you're in the right place. If the answer is yes here, you need a different application. This is for LOMAs only. So no fill being done. This is just a structure that is already there and just happens to be shown in the floodplain when the elevation survey showed that the structure is above the base flood elevation. And you have your legal description of your property. Are you requesting that a flood zone determination be completed for a structure on your property? So then you give the date of construction. A portion of the legally recorded property, or the entire property. So depending on your situation, I think most of the time it's just a structure, but you can have those other situations as well. And then just name, information, telephone. And then we got either a structure located on natural grade or a legal recorded parcel of land or a portion of the parcel of land. And it gives you the elevation that you need from that. So if your structure located on natural grade, then you need the lowest adjacent grade to the structure elevation. And then a legally recorded part, if it's just a parcel of land that you're going for, then you just need the lowest point on that parcel of land. Property information. Always make sure you pay attention to your datums. This is important. And so that's the datum of the, that's horizontal datum. Vertical datum is down here. Your flood insurance rate map information, which panel that is located in. And we'll go over that in a little more detail in the other MT2 application. There's where you post your low engagement grade elevation right there in the nearest 10th of a foot, and then your datum. This is between these two datums. You can, through in Kansas, you can be around a half a foot off between these two datums. And that shift varies across the state a little bit. Of course, then you get into like Colorado and it can go up to like 3 feet off. So important to pay attention to that datum. And we got this question if you have any subsidence or uplift, which we do have some of that in the state. So if your property is sinking, because I don't know about any uplift in the state. And then the certified information for the certified professional and the seal. So you need to have a licensed surveyor, engineer, certify the elevation. And then a checklist of items that you need to include here. So effective firm panel that your property is located in, the subdivision plat map, or the property deed. And then include a map scale and north arrow on all maps to show the location of the property in question. And that should, I know they want to make sure that your map has, identifiable information on it. So show like a street intersection or something that you can reference back to the firm panel on. So something that you can clearly see where to line up the map with the firm panel. And there you go, where you can submit online or the clearinghouse to send paper applications to. So that's the MT Easy form. Go back to my presentation here. Oh, I guess maybe I should click through the MT1 form as well, show the differences here. I don't know why they have that one as a Word document and this one's a form filled PDF, but that's what they have. So here there's a little bit more to this form. Where you can do the different types of letter map change here. Instead of just the MT Easy is LOMAs only. And so with this form, we can do all these, but some of the same questions. Is there fill? And are we raising the ground that is below the BFE? So in that case, are we placing fill in the floodplain itself? Property information, same question here, the floodplain determination on the structure or just on the land itself. And then single structure or multiple structures. And then the same checklist of, except for now you have this elevation form. So this is where you get an elevation certificate that is completed by a licensed surveyor. And then with LOMR Fs and CLOMR Fs, we have a community acknowledgement form. So you actually, the community, all communities that you're located within need to sign the community acknowledgement form. So that could be cities and counties. And then a CLOMR F documented Endangered Species Act compliance. So you actually have to go through the process of checking for any endangered species on the property. And we'll go through that a little bit later. Then with this form, you have your fees. Make sure you're paying those. And that's this next page is the elevation form. So same thing that we saw on the others. You do have to give some details about the type of construction here, if it's got a basement or slab on grade or there's a crawl space. Datums, and then the certifier information. And then there's, if you have the multiple lots, list out every property on the that letter of map change is addressing. And this is the community acknowledgement form, where you get a sign off of community officials, which it seems like most of you are the community officials on this call. So and then that's just the payment form. And no, I don't want to take a brief survey. Okay, and we kind of went through what documents are required for each of these, but this is a nice table to show you for all of them at once. But those, you see each one of those forms has a checklist to remind you of what's needed. From the property information form, elevation form, and these are just those different pages of that form that I just walked through. So for all applications, you don't need, so if you're just doing a LOMA or CLOMA, you don't need the community acknowledgement form. And of course, you don't need design plans if you're just doing a CLOMA or a LOMA, because you're just showing that the structure is out and you haven't actually added any fill or changed the topography in any way. And then, of course, ESA compliance is only for the LOMR. Of course, I want to point out this is kind of the same thing for LOMR, CLOMR that we'll talk about later. But you see that the LOMR it does not require the ESA compliance, but the CLOMR does. It's really, this is assuming that you've already gone through your due diligence and done the ESA compliance. So really, you should be doing Endangered Species Act check, whether you're doing a LOMR or a CLOMR. Really, anytime that you're making modifications, there should be ESA compliance, and that's what this star down here says, asterisk. And then there's this double asterisk on the project design plans that, that wasn't on the checklist, but this will, if you have design plans, give them, because this helps the review process go much more smoothly. There, we already went through the actual forms. And so the copy of your flood insurance rate map for the actual location. Of course, now that we have the mapping service center where we can generate these fermets, this is a pretty easy process. I can click through this and go through it really quick. But just a simple address search, and I'm sure most of you are all familiar with this, but we'll go through it just in case. So I can type in a specific address and it'll go to it. And then, but we can go to our project location, wherever that may be. It'll give us and you can see these numbers here are the actual firm panel and the effective date. So that's needed for those applications. So that's a good place to get that information. If I want to do a project here along the Shunga, I can zoom in, and then I can, anywhere that I want to drag this map to, I can download my map image and I'll have my format sheet to include with my application. And there's also, you can click this show all projects if you want to actually download the actual flood insurance rate map panels and see any amendments that are already applied here. So you can see a list of all letter of map changes that are in the area. So for you community officials, this is a good resource to see if there's any active LOMRs or LOMAs in Shawnee County. Of course, we have a ton of them. So the maps that we went through on that checklist, the subdivision plat map, and you want this with the recordation data and stamp of the recorder's office on there. You want the official plat map and the property deed from the recorder's office as well. That actually gives the legal description of the area. And this is where I want to point out, remember, the map should include one street intersection that is shown on the firm panel. We need some way to line up our property map with our firm panel or floodplain map. ESA compliance. So there is a planning tool that will help with this compliance. The Endangered Species Act. This website will allow you. We'll go ahead and click through here. This website allows you to search for any endangered species in an area. So I can do the same, type in an address here, and draw a polygon around my project area. And this will give me a list of any endangered species that are known to be within this territory. And I can click on any information about these endangered species, so you can get information about their habitats to see if you are encroaching on any of their habitats, impacting their habitats, which is where you'll run into problems. So it'll also show critical habitats, but there are none in this location. But this list does not mean you can or cannot go through with your project here. This is just a helpful list of potential endangered species in the area. And you need to watch out for making any changes to their known habitats. You also have the bald and golden eagles if they're in here. Of course, this is a bald eagle area. And then migratory birds, show all the migratory birds that pass through, and you have a probability of presence summary. So you can actually click on this and you can see when those migratory birds will be through. So complying with doing ESA compliance for your project might just mean that you are constructing it during a time when those migratory birds are not present. So just if you know that there's a migratory birds that pass through your area, you can avoid their migration or their mating season or whatever you need to avoid using this calendar. And so you go through, you can look at all of this, see if you have any fish hatcheries or wetlands. Of course, the wetlands is not working. So you can just open up the wetlands inventory map yourself and go look yourself. So since it's not click through very well there, not integrated very well. Of course, there are, I need to find a wetland. Oh, there's some over here. I don't know if I trust my map is showing up here. There we go. I don't like this map. It's not loading when I zoom in. But you can also download this data. Oh, there, it's starting to show up. There we go. Just took a while. So you can see if through here we got a little bit of wetland area. So depending on where I put that project location, of course, this is all park. We could have wetlands in there. Okay, go back to my ESA without stopping sharing here. All right, so you can print this, a full PDF of all the potential endangered species in your list, and this is what you can use for some of your documentation for your form, but it is not all you need. Oh, I do not like that. They'll see if you want to, if you need a official, and you need a correspondence with U.S. Fish and Wildlife You have to go through this define project, and you actually have to log in, create a IPAC account. And when you click this through, it'll generate a letter to U.S. Fish and Wildlife that will, you know, you explain your project and your project area. You provide this resource list. You say, I have looked through, we're doing a project here. There's no known endangered species in this list, or there are known migratory birds, and we're doing this and this for mitigation. We're avoiding their migration season. We're not touching the stream area where they may be located. We're away from that area. These types of things. We are, I don't know, building bat houses to provide more places for the endangered bats to live, those types of things. And you will have an official correspondence with U.S. Fish and Wildlife. And they will run a check and send you a concurrence with your statement here. All right, lessons learned on these MT1 applications. So I've mentioned every time I saw it is the datum conversions. Pay attention to your datum conversions. That can give you up to half a foot of error in Kansas, more in other states. Make sure you're paying attention to where the fill will be placed. If it's, you're okay if you're in the floodplain and you can still just get by with an MT1 application. If you hit floodway, you are probably gonna have to go to an MT2 application. Make sure you get all jurisdictions in the community acknowledgement form. So, you might have city and county that you need to sign off on a form, not just one or the other. Check your ESA compliance for LOMR F. Even though it's only required for CLOMR F, make sure you check it for LOMR F. Again, they're assuming that you went through the CLOMR process and you've already done your ESA compliance. Making sure you're paying the correct amount, checking the correct payment level for what you need. That'll decrease any delays that they may cause. Used approved hydrology and hydraulic methods. FEMA has a list of approved methods in their documentation that you can find on their website. So making sure you or whatever consultant you hire is following the FEMA approved procedures. Obviously, they're pushing you towards online submissions. Use that. It'll make it go quicker. And always recommend doing a CLOMR before a LOMR, CLOMR F before LOMR F, to making sure that you're doing everything correctly before you go through the expensive construction project. And of course, even if you get certified to be out of the floodplain, you are close to the floodplain if you are shown as in. So you should still, of course, there's always a bigger flood. This is just the 1% chance storm event that this is showing. There's still a pretty good chance of you flooding, and so you should still get flood insurance whether you are in or out of the floodplain after this process. Listed again and again, use the FEMA resources for help. That is the full MT1 application process. Before we get into MT2, are there any questions from anyone? I don't see any in the chat.
Okay, not hearing any questions. And I think we had a break scheduled, right, Ben, right
Yep,
now?
we can go ahead
Okay.
and take a break.
Yeah, so let's take a break until 9:15 and then we'll come back and get started on the second part.
All right. So now we'll move into our MT2 applications. So we'll go over what types of things the MT2 application covers, when you would actually need to use this MT2 applications, and what is required for these applications. Of course, these are more involved applications than the MT1, so there's a little bit more to this. And after we talk about this, we will walk through a kind of an example of what you would, the process you would go through for an example project. All right, so what is an MT2 application? This is actual revisions to the flood insurance rate maps when you're actually changing the floodplains or floodways. It's applicable to LOMR's letter of map revision and CLOMR's conditional letter of map revisions. And so you'll use these anytime that you're changing a flood elevation, any changes to the floodway boundary, changes properties in an alluvial fan, request involving property or structures elevated on fill in a floodway. So anything involving a floodway needs to go through an MT2 application, and anything involving coastal high hazard zones. Of course, we don't need to deal much with that in Kansas. So really any change to a actual floodplain on a map needs an MT2 application. So the forms are in the same place as the previous forms we went over, MT1 and MT Easy. And then there are multiple forms in the case of the MT2 form. So we have this form 1, form 2, form 3, 4, 5, 6. But you can see they're not all going to be needed for all situations. So if you're doing coastal, not doing coastal structures, form 4 and 5 won't be needed. And form 6 is, of course, only alluvial fans. So 4, 5, and 6 are not of much use in Kansas. So what do we need to complete these forms? Here's a nice checklist, and you can see that there's only one blank in this table, and that is for ESA compliance on a LOMR. And then, but we have this asterisk here that says you should do it anyway. Really, we're kind of assuming that we've already gone through our due diligence in our CLOMR process, and that's why we don't need it for the LOMR. It's already been constructed. It's already gone through that process, but you should do the check if you did not go through this process. So what we need: project narrative, the overview and community concurrence form, riverine hydrology and hydraulics form, if you're actually changing the hydrology and hydraulics of an area, riverine structures form, Do you have a structure? And then, of course, you got your coastal and alluvial fan stuff, which we don't deal much with around here. Certified topographic map. You need to have your actual grading plan of how you're changing the topography in your project area. Annotated firm reflecting changes. So mark up the flood insurance rate map showing where the changes actually occurred. Your as-built or design plans, depending on if you're doing a LOMR or a CLOMR. Your design plans for a CLOMR, your as-built for a LOMR. You have to make sure you're notifying all affected property owners. So you have to go through, prove that you've gone through the process, due diligence, and notified anybody impacted by these changes. These are part of your regulatory mapping requirements, and also the public notice, and then ESA compliance and payment forms. So what should be in this project narrative? This is, I think, one of the most important parts, and it's also the one that is least defined in the FEMA process. They just say you need it. They don't tell you how to do this part. But the better your project narrative, the easier the whole application and review process is going to go. So, the more detail that you are using to inform the reviewer of the project and the purpose, the quicker this is going to get through the process. You definitely want to provide as many graphical figures as you can, show your full grading plan, any changes that are made to the area before and after. Discuss why you're building this project. Include any phase information, so how the plan for construction and any future plans for construction, and all the methods that were used to analyze this in detail. And you want to make sure that all those methods meet the FEMA criteria for H&H studies. And that is definitely the part that gets the most scrutiny in review, and you want to explain yourself as good as possible to get through that process as smooth as possible. We've already talked about ESA compliance, kind of gone through this same thing here. Again, I'll make the point that this is only a requirement for CLOMR, but that's the LOMR is assuming that you've already gone through this process. It should be done both ways. Of course, you should be doing a CLOMR before you construct the project, so you should have already gone through this, and your LOMR should just be a showing how everything was built and you followed what you said you would in the CLOMR. I guess I did not mention earlier this was on here, but there's the address to where you're sending. That's the Kansas Ecological Services for U.S. Fish and Wildlife. Their address there in Manhattan, and email and phone number for any questions you may have about the ESA compliance. You are required for these changes to a flood insurance rate map to notify the public of the changes. So here's some community newspaper notification examples that show you an example of how you might word this notification, and you just insert the appropriate information for your project. using this standard verbiage. And then here's the notification letters for, I mentioned them briefly earlier. Any impacted property owners need to be directly contacted and informed of the changes that are made. And throughout the process, they will have there is a appeal period where they are allowed to make an appeal to if they have any objections to the project. So as part of your compliance, you need to provide proof that certified letters were sent to all property owners. I got a question there. Is there any freedom to change the wording on this notifications form? I think you can some. Tara, have we have we ever changed anything? Do you know?
I'm not sure offhand. I think you could some, but again, I think you'd want to generally follow what's given here.
You have to include all the information that's kind of in this. So, you know, your your changes are pretty minimal if you actually including all that. So, you know, changing a word here or there, but um you have to say exactly what the changes are going to be, what the increases in elevations are. So you're, you know, what you have to say is pretty set in stone here, but yeah, I think you can adjust it a little bit. Submitting the applications, same as MT1. They really want you to do the online. Online will make this go smoother. If you are doing mail-in, Kansas, all Kansas requests will go to this LOMAC clearinghouse in Alexandria, Virginia. There are some jurisdictions that do not go here who have their own controls, such as the Denver Urban Drainage and Flood Control District or the Harris County Flood Control District, San Antonio River Authority, and then there's 3 states there: Alabama, Illinois, North Carolina, that have their own places to send these applications. But all of Kansas goes to this Alexandria, Virginia address. Here it is again. Use the help. Always use the help offered by FEMA. So now we'll actually try to walk through an example of a project here. This is I'm gonna try to describe the project example that we have here, and you'll also see some slides that are outside of that project example because I'm trying to provide some context for 2D letter of map changes, because that, I know that's, everybody has the question of how that's going to change, and since all new modeling pretty much is 2D modeling at this point, everybody wants to know how that changes thing. I'm going to try to provide that context here, of course, with the caveat that this is continuously changing. FEMA is in the process of going through these transitions and all their guidance, so it is a little bit of a moving target right now, but I'll try to explain the best I can where we are right now, and try to explain a little bit of where they might head in the future. So we want to build a house on this site highlighted in blue here. This house is going to be within the floodplain. We see the floodplain there on our map. We can see we're going to need to do some a little bit of fill in the floodplain here to elevate that house out of the floodplain. But that's all we know. That's what somebody comes to us. They want to build a house on this property. They want to build it inside the floodplain. They say, what do I need to do to be able to do this and be out of the floodplain? So first thing we're going to do is we're going to go to the mapping service center and we're going to see what the floodplains look like in this area. So here is what we get. Um, that area that was highlighted right there where they want to build in the floodplain, I can see that that's pretty much all floodway. So they are actually wanting to build this new structure in the floodway. So Tara, this time for that third poll question.
All right, I will
We'll
bring it
quiz
up.
you.
Yeah. Here we go. So what is needed for this project scenario?
Remember, you just have to answer. You don't have to answer right.
Right. Just have to answer to get credit for the CECs, but you don't have to get it correct. So just make your best guess if you're not sure. Leave it open just a little longer. There's still a few that haven't answered. Okay, there's a couple more coming in. All right, I'm going to go ahead and end that and share the results. It looks like we're kind of split here, so I'm sure Ben's going to go over the answer.
We're all over the place here, but I
Yes.
see most of us got it right. So the highest percentage here, it is a LOMR and a no rise because we are going to have to change the floodway. So anytime you change the floodway, you are going to need a no rise certificate to show that you are not increasing the base flood elevation anywhere in the floodplain. So, these floodways were put in with the idea that it is safe to build anywhere in the fringe and you can construct and safely do fill without negative impacting flooding anywhere else in the floodplain. And so if you do actually build in the floodway, you got to prove that so we've already kind of, with the floodway modeling itself, we've proven that you don't negatively impact flooding if you build in the fringe. But if you build in the floodway, you've got to go through this extra step of proving that you are not going to increase this flooding anywhere. Which we'll talk a little bit more about. 2D, that's where probably the biggest questions are with 2D modeling is how do we do no rise? And that's a bit of that's still a little bit up in the air, but I will give my best interpretation of the current rules right now here a little later. Okay, so our next step here is to go to the IPAC and do a ESA compliance check. Go through, map out our area of change there on that website, just like I did before, and see if there's any endangered species that we might have in this area. Next step after that is to get the current effective model. So we need to get a hold of the model that was used for the effective floodplains. Sometimes this is easier than others. If you're in a really old area with paper maps, you're probably not going to find the model. You won't be able to get a hold of the model. And you will have to create a duplicate effective model. So essentially, you have to create a new model that shows the floodplains as they are on the map. In this case, we do have, this is a 1D unsteady state model, actually, in the case of this example. So to get a hold of this model, you'll either have to go through FEMA or the state has them sometimes. I wish there were a more clear process of doing this. The state is in process of building a online database of all a 2D model inventory. So all the new modeling will get put up in an easy to get to accessible location here eventually, but we're not there yet. So for now, you'll have to request it. And then in the case of a 2D model, this is going to look a lot different. So if our study location is this pink area, then instead of having that list of cross sections, we just have a 2D mesh. So depending on the type of model you get, you may have no model where you have to generate a duplicate effective and kind of, duplicate effective, you're trying to build a model just like they did to build that firm and try to get the same results, which of course, getting the same results on a paper map is tricky in itself. So because they're using outdated topography, you're even going to do a corrected effective model. So you're saying this is going to be a little bit different than the original because the topography has changed, the hydrology has changed, things have changed. And then if your effective is 2D, of course, this is where I know there's fewer people that are familiar with the process of going through and changing these models. So in our example case here, if we want to create a corrected effective model, this is where we think maybe that the model doesn't currently show enough detail on our actual project site to even know if our construction will impact it. I mean, in some cases, say if I wanted to do a LOMR right here in this property, well, I probably need a pointer. You probably can't see me, can you? How do I start my pointer? You see that now?
Yes, I can see it.
All right. So if this was our property that we wanted to do a construction and say we wanted to build a building, somewhere or even right here where this, I don't know what that is right now, that might be a little sewage lagoon or something, but if we want to do construction right here, we're still in the floodway, it's still the same thing, and my project location is right here. My model doesn't even see that project location. So, somebody clever might come in here and think, oh, I'm going to do that. And I show it in my model and I can change that in my model, but nothing actually changes in the model, in the 1D model, and it shows no change. But a reviewer is going to look at that and say, well, wait a second, the model doesn't even see your changes. So you need to add additional information into the model so it can see your project location in more detail. So we may need to add some extra cross sections into our 1D model to make a corrected effective model. And really, we want this to, we want it to match the effective. So we don't want to be change. We want to make sure that we're not, when we add in this more detail, we're not actually changing the elevations on the cross sections around it. So we want to keep everything consistent in that model, as consistent as we can. Now in 2D, this is a little bit different where you're not changing cross sections, but we probably do want to change mesh alignment. So I have this big 2D mesh here. And so I might take my project area here and draw it as what we call a refinement region in the model and just make sure that my mesh aligns with my project. So in the same way that those extra cross sections allow the model to actually see the changes accurately, we're doing the same thing here. to just show better detail on where we're actually constructing our project here, our structure our proposed structure. But again, we want to do this without actually changing anything else in the model. So we've got this model. We want to make sure that we're not changing our model too much. So we're checking our corrected effective against our actual effective model. We added this one cross section right here, and we can see that adding that, we had a couple hundredths of change, but that's tolerable, and it was actually a drop. So if this were in the tenths, we would probably want to rethink what we're doing here. We do want to make sure that we tie in to our effective model. And what that means, if this were in the tenths, we would probably have to look at changing more cross sections or extending our study area. And then if we're actually impacting these areas, then any properties that touch anything in the changes, of course, we're going to have to get. So we'd be expanding the location of our LOMR and making our review process more difficult and making our due diligence process more difficult, because we'll be impacting more properties. So we definitely want to make sure that the top and the bottom cross sections here are 0. Next, we want to make sure that we are building our structure up to a level that is, a foot above at least a foot above in Kansas, our base flood elevation. So our base flood elevation, we want to get our low adjacent grade here elevation. So a couple of examples here of where the elevation that we need to check our freeboard against that needs to be a foot above our BFE is at the lowest floor here. The C2A elevation in both of these examples. Of course, if you're building a structure with a basement, this gets trickier because your floor is actually below that grade, but your low adjacent grade, your grade is above. There are additional requirements in that situation to be in compliance, like, make sure that you have the sump pump. You got to make sure that you have, there is a maximum amount of difference that those can be. And there is also a maximum amount of distance that grade can be from the BFE. So it gets a little trickier when you have a below grade bottom floor. All right, next step is to develop the proposed condition model. So here we need our grading plan, how we're going to change the elevations on our site. And we're going to make a copy of that corrected effective model. And we're going to apply those changes to this proposed condition model, copy of the effective corrected model, adjust the cross sections, the elevations in the cross sections that pass through this, change in grading, and run the model to see the differences in elevations. And remember, this is in a floodway, so those differences have to be 0. If you're actually making changes to the ground surface, the roughness, so if there were a bunch of trees in here and you remove those trees and went to bare ground, lawn or grass, pasture, whatever, that you would have to show that change in the roughness in your cross sections as well as the elevation changes. So show any changes that you are proposing to make in this model. So it might look something like this. In this particular location, this is in Sedgwick County. This is along Cowskin Creek, I believe, or one of its tributaries. I don't remember exactly. But in that area, there is a compensatory cut and fill floodplain cut and fill requirement. So you are not allowed to change. There's additional requirement on top of the normal FEMA requirements that say you cannot change the storage, floodplain storage in this area, because this is a very storage sensitive floodplain area. So a traditional 1D model would not see that if you filled all this in, it wouldn't know any different. It's just going by straight conveyance. But this is an unsteady model, so any change in storage is going to impact flooding. And remember, we need to do a no rise. We need to add in our excavation to this as well. So we're filling, and in the amount of floodplain that we're taking away, we're adding in that same amount of area back in as cut in the floodplain to maintain our floodplain storage. There's only a few areas that would have this requirement, but it is something to think about. Anywhere where you have an unsteady model, it's going to see that change. So it's going to be more sensitive to stuff like this. So you might have to do it, even if it's not a requirement, just to meet the no rise criteria. Same in a 2D model. They are volume sensitive, unlike the old 1D steady state models. So you have to be aware of changes you make to the floodplain storage will impact flooding on downstream. So we change the cross sections in our model. We rerun our proposed conditions model, and we need to compare this to our corrected effective, which is our existing conditions model. We have a table here, and you can see that we have to make sure that the surcharge, because this is a no rise, because we are in a floodway, all of these numbers have to be below 0.00 or below. So if this were a positive 0.01, I would have to go and make more changes, potentially add more floodplain cut to account for the lost storage, or something along those lines to account for those changes. So this may be an iterative process for the engineer working on it. They have to try several things, usually do have to try, do kind of an iterative check on these things until you get to a acceptable no foot rise, zero rise condition. After you do this, make sure you check your freeboard assumption. Of course, if we're no rise, it should still match up. Should be fine. If this were a floodplain change in the floodplain fringe and didn't impact the floodway, then we would definitely want to make sure, because you may change your BFEs in that situation. So you want to make sure that your freeboard assumption that you made in the previous step, that you're still that 1 foot above BFE for your flow adjacent grade on your structure. Um, 2D analysis. So no rise in 2D is a different process. So I don't know if any of you are familiar with 2D modeling, but if you make any change to a 2D mesh, it is nearly impossible to get 0.00 change. Any little change you make will affect across the entire mesh to get 0.00 change. So knowing this, FEMA has made some adjustments to the criteria. So where we're only going to compare the elevation change, the surcharge at what we call evaluation lines, which are really just base flood elevation lines, BFE lines. So we're going to draw these evaluation lines across our 2D mesh. And then across that line, this is the cross section underneath that line. We have to make sure that the average unit discharge, the average surcharge across all these cells. And then there is an example. This is using unit discharge average. So they're actually weighting the surcharge by unit discharge, so that the surcharge in this across this channel cell, because it has more of the discharge, more of the flow is in here, it weights this heavier than these outside edges. This is an example of how you can average it across each BFE. But I will say we actually do this differently. We actually just do a linear average. So each mesh cell surcharge has the same weighting based on just the length of it across it. So everything is even across there, where this one is this example. So it does say in the guidance that this is just an example. You can use any acceptable averaging technique. And then you have 4 criteria that you need to meet after you do these calculations. So, and I don't like that this is listed as 4 because really it's only 3. So the average across each of these BFE lines needs to be within the allowable surcharge range. So here, this example is for just floodway analysis in general. So it says 0 to 1 feet. For no rise, this just needs to be 0. So all averages need to show no rise. They need to be 0 or below, 0.00. All cells overlapping insurable structures have to be 0, have to show no rise. So if I have a house in a mesh cell, that cell has to be 0.00 surcharge or less or negative. And then, but for all other mesh cells that do not touch an insurable structure, you are given, this is where 3 and 4, where really it's only 3, because this is all cells considered in the BFE average need to be plus or minus half a foot from your required. So in our case, this is for floodway analysis. So in our no rise analysis, it needs to be just plus or minus half a foot. And all cells not considered in the BFE average are within the allowable surcharge. So if you combine these two, which I wish they would, it's just all mesh cells in the floodplain area need to be plus or minus half a foot from your target elevation, which in a floodway analysis, it's 1 foot. In a no rise analysis, it's 0.00. So you can have individual mesh cells that are out of compliance as long as they don't touch a insurable structure, and that the average across any BFE is still 0.00. Now, I know that's kind of confusing to have me explain, and especially if you're not a modeler, you probably don't understand that. But this is the way we're going now that we're going all new studies in 2D. And there is talk of some new guidance coming out here in the coming years. And they actually want to allow more flexibility in this. Right now, the no rise is not really well defined. That's why all this is just floodway analysis related, because they have not specifically said, it doesn't say anywhere in the guidance that you should use this criteria for no rise, although it's kind of generally accepted that way because they don't tell you what to use for no rise right now. So I think in future guidance, this will be better defined and there will be more flexibility in it, as in like to deal with some of the difficult places to deal with are anywhere where there's multiple flow paths. And if you made a change in fill for a LOMR in one of those flow paths, it may increase the other flow paths but out of tolerance. So there's going to be more coming in guidance that will allow more flexibility in some of those situations. They're aware of some of the pain that some of this has caused. So I'm just trying to allow for more situations. So after we've proven that we have a no increase in surcharge with our modeling, we know that this is because we are changing the floodway here. We cannot just do a simple LOMR F. If we are in the fringe and this was not in a floodway, we could do a LOMR F. So we know we need to go straight to LOMR or CLOMR. Of course, we should do a CLOMR, and I'm always going to suggest doing a CLOMR. FEMA will always suggest doing a CLOMR before LOMR, but it is not a requirement. So now we can walk through our MT2 application. And we have to, so for this particular project, see, we've checked what we actually need. Project narrative, the overview, form 1, our riverine hydrology and hydraulics form. This is definitely required for this one because we are changing the hydraulics through the area. We are not doing a structure. So this would be if you're putting in a new bridge or culvert across the river itself, or a dam, anything along those lines. You would need to fill out the riverine structures form. We are not doing this for this example project. Of course, we'll no coastal, no alluvial fan. Make sure we include our certified topographic map of our grading plan, our annotated firm with changes. So we need to, in this case, we are not actually changing the profile or the base flood elevation. So we do not need to change the flood insurance study report for this. Everything in that will remain the same. We need a set of as-built plans or design plans, depending on if we chose LOMR, CLOMR. Notification to affected properties. We need to do our due diligence. Of course, this is if we're actually did the LOMR. Making sure we met all of our NFFP mapping regulatory requirements because we are changing the map. ESA compliance, again, that is a requirement for CLOMRs, not a requirement for LOMRs, but we should do it anyway. And then, of course, payment information. And I need to pull up my form. So we got our instructions, and then we got our payment information form. This is going to look just like the sheet on the MT1 for our payment. We've got our overview and concurrence form. So we need to fill out, are we doing a LOMR or a CLOMR? Check the box. This is a list of the affected flood insurance rate map panels. So that number that we pulled off of our format there, or our from the mapping service center. Flooding source, that would be the name of the river that we're building on here. And types of flooding. In our case, this is just riverine. And I believe it's Cowskin Creek. Project name, FEMA zone designations. So in this case, it's AE, and revised will also be AE. AO, AH are your shallow flooding zones. And then these A1 through 30, A99 are the old paper maps. So if you have very old, only if you have old maps are you dealing with those zone designations. Or many of these zone designations are outdated now, only on old maps. So basis for the request, what are we doing? And you need to check all that apply. So we are doing a physical change, not a coastal, not a weir dam. We have new topographic data and maybe improved methodology and data. We're doing a hydraulic analysis, no levees, regulatory flood revision, no change in hydrologic analysis, no alluvial fan, base map changes. We are making changes, corrections, which we did do a corrected effective. And here it says a note, a photograph and narrative description of the area concern is not required, but very helpful during review. Always suggest to do that detailed project narrative. And then the area of revision encompasses the following structures. So we are not making a change to the channel. We are not doing anything with a levee or flood wall. We are not changing a bridge or culvert. No dam. We are doing some fill. And then check that you have documentation of ESA compliance submitted. And then review your fee. Have you made sure it's correct? Yes. And your amount from that table. And here they give you a link here to where that table is on their website. And then just general information, community concurrence here, and requesters. So this would probably be your property owner, developer, and then your community concurrence. And then your certified professional. So your engineer that's signing off on this will need to seal it. And which forms are included with this. In this case, it is only the riverine and hydraulics form. If we go and look at our riverine and hydraulics form, so we have our flooding source, same thing you listed before, Cowskin Creek. Reason for the new hydraulic analysis. So proposed conditions. Or I guess we're not doing this is not revised. Sorry. This is hydrologic. So we don't need to worry about any of this. If we are doing updated hydrology, you would need to give the changes to the flows in the FIS. So we have our effective flows and our revised flows at the locations and drainage areas. And I would, if this is done, you definitely want to describe this in more detail than just this in your project narrative. And of course, you have how precipitation was determined, if you did a statistical or gauge analysis, regional regression. So which these are the generally accepted methodologies for FEMA studies. If you go to other, you better have a good description and make sure that it is accepted by FEMA. And here it says to remind you to include documentation to support the new analysis. And we probably don't need to worry about. So this is if your community requires additional review by the local, regional, state, whoever, then you have to include that review. And then this sediment transport on hydrology, this most of the time this is going to be a no, but it could be in some situations. You may have some sediment impacts. Describe exactly where you're changing. Then we're in the hydraulics section. Your upper and lower limit. Give your cross-section stationing from the effective model. And then your change in water surface. So this is that table that I showed in the previous slide. Your effective and proposed elevations. This is a no rise. So of course, these should all be identical for your upstream and downstream limit. Describe your methodology used, and then steady state. In our case, this was an unsteady state, one-dimensional model. A lot of new modeling going forward will all be unsteady state, two-dimensional modeling. And this is review of the pre-submittal review of the hydraulics here. So you're going to describe your model with your file name, plan name for HECRAS files, and your datum. Always pay attention to your datum. So details of your modeling. If you did a corrective effective model, if you did a duplicate effective model, this is where I described about if you don't have access to the old models, if you're still on paper maps, those models are not archived anywhere, so you could not get a hold of them. You had to generate a duplicate effective model. In our case, we developed a corrected effective model. We did not have a duplicate effective model. Existing conditions model, and then revise, which the existing conditions model is our corrected effective model in this case. Same thing, and then revised model. And then if you have any other checks that go on here. And then digital models submitted, yes, required. That's just a reminder for you to include those. And the instructions, you can see this asterisk. The instructions for this will remind you what a duplicate effective model is, what a corrected effective model is.
Hey, Ben, I have a question.
Okay.
So you're talking about how this particular situation doesn't have a rise, right? And so
Correct.
can you just explain a little bit more about the need for a LOMR if there is a no rise being completed?
Okay, so if there is a no rise being completed and there is any change in the floodplain, then you still need to do a LOMR.
Okay. So where would the change be occurring in this situation? If there's no rise, so it's not changing the elevations, where is that like a change in elevation
So
or a change to the
it's a change in topography that's causing this. Let's see if I can go back to image here. But so in our new model, we are putting fill in. That is a really bad image. We have a better one. Um, we're filling in this area right here, and the floodplain cut or the floodway cut right through it. New floodway is going to follow this kind of contour down here. So we are actually changing the boundaries of the floodway and floodplain. So anytime you change the boundaries of the floodway or floodplain, you need to do a LOMR.
Okay,
If
yes. I
if
guess I was thinking that that change would possibly cause a change in the elevation, would cause a rise or cause a, but
well, yeah, we had to prove that that
you could
change
prove.
did not cause a
Okay.
rise with our modeling. Um,
Okay.
so a situation where you do a no rise, but you don't need a LOMAR would be if we are just like if we were replacing this bridge structure right here, and we are replacing it with a equivalent structure, but we had to do construction in the floodplain. We have to prove that our new structure that may be slightly different is not going to change the flood elevations. And if it did not, we did not change the modeling at all. So we only need the no rise. We do not need the LOMAR.
Okay, but the LOMR process can be used for actual changes to the elevation in the floodway as well, correct?
Yes. Now you have to get, if you are changing elevations in the floodway, you have to go through a lot more approvals because there are only um, specific situations where they allow that.
Okay, thank you.
And it's probably has to be community driven by that point. You probably won't get that from a developer driven project. That can only be done through a community driven project where, something where the change will benefit the community overall, but it does change the base flood elevations and the floodway. So there are special caveats for that type of situation in the requirements, FEMA requirements. Okay, which one was I on here? We submitted our digital modelings. We want to make sure that we give our topographic information and digital elevation models, either contours or um, actual Esri grids. They want to see that. That will help you with your not required, but preferred, as it says here. That'll make the review process go easier, smoother, quicker. And then, of course, your source of your topographic information, if you had a survey done, if it's LiDAR data, newer LiDAR data, date that was collected, your datum, your projection, and your vertical accuracy. And then here's another checkbox that says annotated firm or BF. This is required. That's just a reminder checkbox. Yes, I did do that. And this is a reminder here in this comment that remember that you must tie in with the effective floodplain. So your upstream and downstream need to match up exactly with the effective. So the limits of your study, if they don't, you either have to go in and modify your modeling so that it does match up, or you have to extend your boundary of your change here of your LOMR. So this can get tricky on, like, if you're updating a paper map, that's tie-ins to, or even if you have digital mapping, but it was done on old 10-meter DEMs, the old USGS quad contours, it may be tricky, and you're using the new LiDAR data as your elevation, your better topography source. it can be very difficult to get those two to tie in together. So just something to be aware of. They do need to tie in some way. But in some situations, that's more difficult than others. If the modeling is fairly new and was done on LiDAR data, which we're getting to where most of it is in the state of Kansas, then it shouldn't be too bad to match up. Do base flood elevations or special flood hazard areas increase compared to the effective BFEs? And we have to say no in this because we're changing a floodway. And then if it does change, this is where you need to have the proof of property owner notification. So anybody that you change base flood elevation on, you have to send that certified letter that we had the example of in the slideshow, and make sure they are made aware of the changes and notified that they can appeal those changes. So be a good neighbor and make sure you communicate with them so you don't get an appeal by surprise and really slow down your process. So LOMR request, if either of the following is true, please submit evidence of compliance with section 6512. Proposed project encroaches upon regulatory floodway and result in an increase of 0.0 foot compared to the pre-project conditions. So we have that. So we have to prove a no rise. And then the proposed project encroaches on special flood hazard without BFEs. So if you're in a approximate zone, you need to be within 1 foot of the pre-project conditions. You do not need a no rise, but you do need to prove that you did not increase anything by more than a foot. Whereas when the floodway, we're already telling you where you can build to increase it by less than a foot. So you have to prove that you're not changing things at all. Does the request involve the placement or proposed placement of fill? Yes. And then you have to make sure that the community can certify that the area to be removed, include any structures or proposed structures, meets all standards of NFIP. Does the request, and that's the same. They ask you again. I want to make real sure, I guess. And then you need to attach evidence of regulatory floodway revision notification again. You have notified, you have done the notification in the paper as is required, and you've done notified all landowners directly. And I guess with I don't know if they're ever going to change the paper public notification thing, as papers are kind of going away, especially in rural communities. I don't know what they're going to do about that. I mean, we had the weird situation here recently about the Marion. We were publishing in Marion the week that they had the raid on their newspaper. We didn't know if that was going to get published. They did end up publishing though. For CLOMA requests, please submit documentation to FEMA and the community to show that you have completed sections 9 and 10 of the Endangered Species Act. So make sure, reminder to include your ESA compliance. That is the hydraulics form. We'll go ahead. That's all we need for this example project, but we'll go ahead and open up the other forms here. The structures form is one that you may run into a lot. Of course, we don't need to worry about coastal or alluvial fans too much. I just hit the instructions there, not the download. So if you're replacing a bridge or culvert, building a dam, any of those, this is the form that you need to include. Flooding source. And then it tells you, depending on the structure, if you're modifying a channel, if you're building a bridge or culvert, if you're building a dam, if you're building a levee or flood wall, or if you're doing a sediment transport, dealing with sediment transport. So of course, the name of your structure and which type of structure it is, list of locations, your cross-section limits, just like you did on the previous form. And then if you have multiple structures, list them all out. And I know we're doing one in Wichita right now that has more than 3. So for more structures, attach additional pages as needed. I think we're doing like 14 or something in Wichita right now. Channelization. If you're actually modifying the channel, you need to include this, which, you know, depending on your structure here, you may or may not be modifying the channel as well. So you just need to include, you know, your change in the design flow, design what your flow is based on, potential for hydraulic jump, channel design plans, accessory structures, if you have any type of debris basins, any kind of energy dissipators or weirs, low head weirs, drop structures to also there to dissipate the energy there. Do we have sediment transport issues in here? Most of the time that's going to be no, but there are times when you might need that. Bridge or culvert, is it in the current FIS? So you have to say either it was not included in the FIS at all, so we are doing a new, completely new analysis on this bridge, or we are revising a bridge that was previously modeled. Describe your model used to analyze the structure. And again, you see this attached justification. If you make any changes from the norm, from what is accepted by FEMA, you better have a really good justification for it and be prepared to defend it. That's just to stick with what they typically accept. Of course, in most of these, you know, we have it lists HEC 2, Wiz Pro, and HY8, but most of the time we're using HEC-RAS for this. Attach plans. Check all information that's been provided. Really just a checklist of everything that you should have. And then again, it's going to ask the sediment transport. If yes, we have the additional form to fill out, additional section of the form. If you're building a dam, same thing. Are we modifying existing? Is it new? Or are we just modeling a dam that's already here? Who designed it? Who permitted it? So of course, any dam work you'll have to go through the state. If you're building a dam, let's go through all the approval through the state structures department, KDA. So provide your permit from that. Does the project involve revised hydrology? If you're building a dam, it probably does, at least if it's a flood control dam. So remind you that you have to go make sure that you have a riverine hydrology and hydrologic form filled out for this. And again, this is kind of reminding you, provide supporting documentation. Documentation is really everything in this process. You can see that there's not a lot of detail in these forms. Make sure your report is very good, very detailed. Do you have a debris sediment yield analysis? And with a dam, you should. Those are gonna fill with sediment, and you need to provide how much sediment they are designed to handle. And if no, you better have a good reason for why that was not included. Maybe it's a dry dam. In that case, it doesn't really collect sediment. Does the base flood elevation behind the dam or downstream of the dam basin change? With a dam, most of the time it's going to be yes, unless you're just doing some modifications to bring your dam back into compliance, raising the top of dam, doing things like that. If you don't change the spillway, you're not going to change the base flood elevation. You're just modifying the dam to meet regulations. Then maybe that's a no. And then some information of the ponding elevation behind the dam for your various storm frequencies compared to existing. And you have to prove your O&M manual. So operations and maintenance plan for the dam needs to be submitted. And then we get to levee flood wall. Of course, talking about levees in FEMA is a whole nother can of worms. But of course, anytime that you're gone through the certification process and need to modify a levee in order to get certification, you'll need to go through this process here. So upgrade an existing levee, and then the newly constructed levee is a whole nother process, but a reanalysis of existing flood levee system. So if a previously not certified levee gains certification, then you can go through a LOMR process to change the mapping. To allow it to show that it's providing protection if it was mapped as not showing protection. Type of structure and your stations. So if you have multiple types, you may need more than that in some systems. Types of that goes along with the flood well. Has this been certified? Attach certified drawings, plan of the levee, embankment, flood walls. So all your plan documents, make sure they're all included, show what sheet numbers each one of these items is contained on. Minimum freeboard. And then this is really a checklist that I am meeting all the requirements, 3 feet or more, downstream end and throughout, 3.5 at the upstream end, 4 feet within 100 feet of all structures. If you say no to any of that, they probably aren't going to accept your LOMR. So you're not meeting the certification requirements for showing as providing protection. And then we got our coastal stuff, which is not very applicable in Kansas. If no is answered, please attach an explanation. And then you also have, is there any indication from historical records that ice jamming can affect the BFE? That's not very common in Kansas, but if you're familiar with what happened in Nebraska a couple of years ago, some ice jamming actually was part of the cause of a dam that failed up in Nebraska. So not terribly far away. And then we got our levee internal drainage structures, openings throughout the levee system, if we have them, where they are, type of closure. So you can see levees have a lot more detail. Levees will get a lot more scrutiny over the review process than anything else because they're such a sensitive subject to FEMA. So there is a lot of detail that is required. All the embankment protection details through the entire levee and size of your riprap, depth of flow, all kinds of details. Bedding filter design, embankment foundation stability. Yeah, a lot of details to fill out for levees. And even earthquake stability factors. Seepage analysis, blood pressures, all kinds of many details. Wind loads for flood walls. Settlement information, interior drainage information, what flooding was evaluated on the dry side of the levee. Pump stations, other design. The following items have been addressed. Liquefaction is or is not a problem. Yeah. They're going to have so many items to check here. Proof of levee certification. So That is the structures form. A little more involved if you get into levees, but you can see the road replacements, bridge replacements are fairly straightforward. Dams have a little bit more information, but really you're just providing a few items and proving that you went through the permitting process. And then levies are a whole thing.
So Ben, I do think we're up for another break.
It's a good time for that. All right.
Yeah. All right, so we'll take a 15-minute break and be back at 10:50 to wrap up the rest of the training.
All right. So I guess just for fun, we have the time. I'll just open up these other three that we're very unlikely to use here in Kansas, just in case. But maybe somebody will move to the coast one day. But they're pretty similar to the other forms. They just have coastal items, um, added storm surge modeling, wave height, these types of things. Dune erosion. Really pretty short, more of a checklist to make sure that you have done the analysis you need to do and then show the results. Oh, I hate this Zoom thing getting in my way of my tabs. But in coastal structures, it's going to look a lot like the structures, except for have the items specifically for the seawalls, anchored bulkhead, these things. Now, alluvial fan is something that we can get in Kansas. I don't know that we have anything mapped as an alluvial fan. I don't think we do. I know that this type of landform is one of the big questions in FEMA that FEMA is trying to generate new guidance on for floodways and making these exceptions for no rise analysis and that type of stuff, and how you map these alluvial fan type areas, or just, as I was talking about before, flat multi-flow path areas. So there are changes coming to the guidance based on these types of landforms. Something to be aware of. It is a active topic at FEMA right now. And I know it can affect some places in Kansas, maybe along the Arc Basin, where you have the multiple flow paths, kind of braided stream channel type situations where it's difficult to show the flood risk in that area with just a 1% model without showing the sediment transport. You see a lot of these things with sediment transport listed on them, but where, for example, a sandbar in the arc would be shown as actually out of the 100-year floodplain, but we know that floodplain can move and that sandbar can move during any flood situation. So it really has just as much flood risk as the channel beside it, because during the next flood that could be the channel. So considerations like that are things that FEMA is trying to figure out right now. Another thing I wanted to mention is I've alluded to it a couple times, but didn't explain where some of this stuff was coming from. But it's FEMA's guidelines and standards. These are the documents that we're following when we know how to do our hydrologic analysis, how to do our hydraulic analysis, what is accepted by FEMA as the methods that are accepted by FEMA to complete these. What types of things are FEMA looking for? What do they require? These are all listed in these documents. You can get to these documents if you just go to FEMA's website, flood and maps, and then guidance and reports, then guidelines and standards will take you there. I really should put this link in the PowerPoint somewhere. But then if I click on guidelines, you'll see a lot of guidance for letter of map revision incorporation. This is more for people on the FEMA's end. After you submit your LOMR, this tells them how this is a document on how that gets incorporated into the new maps. We got MT1 technical guidance, MT2 requests, technical guidance here. And a lot of this stuff doesn't really apply. We got PMR specific guidance. Just general mapping and floodplain boundaries that is applicable as you're adjusting the boundaries, changing the floodplains. There's some dams and reservoirs guidance for if you're actually doing a LOMR for a dam. And then these general hydraulic considerations and general hydrologic considerations are both important for determining. And then there's also a 2D analysis document now, but these are all important in figuring out. I'll actually open this one up. What is required? What types of studies are accepted? What processes are generally used? Study methodology. This table that I had, this is a relatively new thing with FEMA as we go into 2D modeling. They have these different levels of detail depending on your study and what the differences between those different levels are. So wherever we have a floodway, we're at least D or E. C is our general BLE level across Kansas, and Zone A level. But it does describe what types of things you need to consider in your modeling. Those are all things you need to take into note as you make these updated model, these corrected effective models or duplicate effective models. Then it has some details on a floodway analysis. I don't believe so. There is a note to the other guidance that these are referring to that give additional details. And the one I want to, is it not even listed in here? The next one I want to talk about, oh yeah, here it is. The floodway analysis and mapping. This is the one that talks about no rise. Doesn't list no rise specifically, but that is the next important one. I'll show you. But if you have any questions about whether the type of modeling you're doing meets the requirements for FEMA modeling, this is the document to check. Got one for hydrology, hydraulics, 2D. Look at the 2D one real quick here. And these are, you see, this was updated last year. It'll get updated again. Many of these will be updated in here this month. So I think usually they come out in November. So we'll see some November 23 guidance soon with some updates. So if you have more detail, if you have to do this with a 2D model, this will give you some more details on how to go about that. There's a little bit on floodway here, but as you see, it also references floodway analysis and mapping guidance. So we'll go to that one next. That's really the last one that I want to point out. And it's a little ways in here. Bunch of coastal specific ones for coastal people. There is a dam, but this is non-regulatory. This is just additional data that's included that is not regulatory for dams. Not so much about if you're adding a dam, doing LOMR for a new dam. Flood risk analysis and mapping, floodway analysis and mapping. This is the one we were looking for. So it's remembering where I was in all these. This is an important one for any LOMR that impacts the floodway. As I zoomed through that part about where we're updating the model and then we're checking it, but that model involves analyzing the floodway to make sure that your floodway is also still in compliance and in compliance the same way as it was before your modification. So there's a little more to it than just my couple of slides showed. But this document explains all of that and the requirements. It does actually get, so that table I showed, that figure with the 2D floodway, floodway figure, I was using it as a reference for no rise because they don't have a no rise specific one. This explains, I kept talking about evaluation lines. This defines evaluation lines, and they're water service contours in a 2D model that we use as BFE lines. So they're not going to be these nice straight things like cross sections a lot of the time. They'll be these funky curvy things. And this talks about surcharge evaluations averaging, where I said that averaging that it gave in the figure, here's the figure that I showed, was just an example. It talks a little bit about that in this paragraph. And gives those requirements, criteria, which it lists 3 criteria though there and 4 here. I don't like that, but maybe we'll clean that up in some future revisions. A little bit confusing. But average surcharge for each evaluation line are 0 for no rise, within 1 No individual 2D cells within a floodway domain are greater than half a foot above the allowable surcharge. So you have this half a foot buffer on all mesh cells as long as your average across the valuation lines meets your requirement. And then any surcharges with cells that intersect insurable structures need to be within the 0.00 or 1 within a normal floodway analysis. So here's special considerations for surcharge averaging. Here's where it talks about the averaging. It references split flows here. That's something we can run into and gets a little tricky. So you're actually averaging each flow path individually instead of, all the way across the floodplain. You're splitting it for multiple flow paths if they have significantly different flood elevations. That's really how you determine if you need to split it or not. And then we get to our so here's our evaluating proposals for floodway development. This is where it lists out the no rise certification. This is where it gives you that caveat that we talked about briefly before about when you can actually change the BFEs in a floodway and what is required to do that. And it talks about how communities should be considering these changes and what needs to be permitted and what doesn't. So, their example is you don't need a permit to build a garden in the floodway. And it's really, but you probably do need a permit to build a garden shed in the floodway if it's going to be a permanent structure. And then here's the no rise section. Now, I will say I don't like, and this is something that will hopefully be improved in future revisions, how it does not at all reference that figure that I was referencing. um, it just says you have 0.00. So if you want to strictly read this, then you can't do what I said you could do with that above figure. But it also doesn't strictly say that either. So it's a little confusing right now. And I think the general consensus amongst the reviewers is that these conditions apply to these criteria apply to floodway or to no rise as well as floodways. You're just changing your 1 foot requirement to 0.00. And I guess for more discussion on that, we do plan on making some videos, posting some videos with more instruction on no rise certification. The state will post those in the future. Where I'll talk more about this criteria. And it's a little hard because it is like I said, it's a moving target. FEMA's actively looking at these requirements. And it talks a little bit about when different types are used, redesign and development to avoid the floodway. Do this. Don't, whenever you can, avoid the floodway, but to replace existing bridges, structures, just kind of gives you some best practices in here. How a no rise certification is developed. Talks about what is required to submit a no rise certificate form or just a letter certification in a letter form, depending on what your community requires, but FEMA accepts either. This talks about how to get existing models from FEMA. So if the state doesn't have it, I mean, it's easier to go through the state to send your request to Tara or her team, but they don't have everything. So you may have to go through this if it's something they don't have. They have most of it though, I think. Describes the corrected effective model, the duplicate effective model a little bit briefly. I don't give much of a description for these things. So here it talks about one or more additional cross sections or edits to the 2D mesh will be necessary. So what I talked about earlier. So I just really wanted you to be aware of these additional documents. These are what I reference when I'm doing the modeling. There's the example no rise certificate. So they don't have an official, this is a community driven thing on what you require, but and this does say, this is a point that I didn't make, but the analysis must be completed using the hydraulic model that was used for the to develop the floodplains if it is still available. So the time you would do the duplicate effective is if it is not no longer available. Or even if it is available, if it's available in an old modeling format, this thing kind of applies. If it's a HEC2 model, they'll let you create a duplicate effective using HEC-RAS. Though we usually don't have HEC2 models, we just have HEC2 results. So you kind of have to do duplicate effective anyway. Here's what I was describing before. If the development is located between existing cross sections, you need to add more cross sections. You can't get away with just saying, hey, it's the model doesn't see it, so nothing happens. And then a 2D model, if you do not have a evaluation line, this is something I didn't mention that I should have. If you have if you do not have an evaluation line, so if your proposed project, just like in a 1D model, if it's between cross sections, if it's between evaluation lines and your 2D results and mapping, then you should add additional evaluation lines that cross your proposed development to ensure that your proposed development is not changing any elevations. And here's where I talked a little bit about Manning's Inn. Make sure that if you're changing the roughness coefficients, then it needs to represent what is actually on the ground. There should be no cumulative impacts of your development. So if everybody does the same thing that you just did for yours, it should have no impact. So this is kind of an equitability thing here too, where no special treatment. If you're doing a 2D model or something else, actually compare the water surface grids, not just the mesh results, to see that there's no rise on actual insurable structures. And then if you are, using compensatory flow area, you're cutting into another area to allow your development in your area. You need to make sure that that area is available in perpetuity. So like if you're using somebody else's land property to and you're basically taking away the developability of another landowner's property, you need to make sure you're not doing that. That's or if you are, buying the easements and doing all the due diligence there. And they will say again and again, contact FEMA if you have any questions at all. They would rather you ask than submit a questionable application. More just tell consider not doing it. Of course, they got to do their best practices here. I think
Hey,
that so
Brian, I have
yeah.
if you don't mind, I have a question, and you kind of scrolled past it, but starting on the bottom of page 51. So it talks about the procedures for applying for a floodway revision, and then it starts talking about the MT2 forms. Is this the section that's applicable to the LOMR process? And then, like, if you go to page 52, and it talks about the procedure for applying for a floodway revision and what it requires, I was just curious how that differs from what you were describing earlier, like what scenario? And I'm not trying to put you on the spot. I was just kind of skimming through it and reading it and curious.
Yeah. So yeah, this is describing the LOMR process. And this is this 65.7. It's mentioned that in this. So this is the actual 65.7 requirement. So when it has been determined that a community has no practicable alternatives to exist to revising the boundaries of its previously adopted floodway, the procedures set below shall be followed. This is what I was talking about when a community actually has the ability to change the elevations in a floodway. So there are exceptions. Like I said, they're pretty much limited to community driven changes, not developer driven changes. It's the equitability thing. If you're one developer wants to change a floodway, they're probably taking opportunity away from other landowners. So it has to be community driven and generally improve the conditions for the entire community. And there's no, practical alternatives to avoid changing this floodway. Now, like the example we went through was just a developer changing a thing that really That's almost like a mapping correction type thing. But even that's going to be scrutinized pretty heavily, even though it was a pretty minor change and didn't impact anybody else. But that's, you have to prove that you do not impact anybody else. Um, and this is really, it's all the requirements that I spoke about. They're telling you have to submit evidence that all affected property owners in the community have been notified. Meets all floodplain management requirements. Federal, state, local permits have been obtained. You've checked Clean Water Act. You've checked Endangered Species Act. I haven't mentioned anything about 404 permitting. We've avoided the channel in our example. But if you make changes to the channel, you probably need a 404 permit as well. Clean Water Act. So you have to go through that process. If the channel itself is changed at all, touched at all. And you have to as a community, adopt the revised floodway as part of your floodway management ordinance. So you're meeting 60.3 requirements and you are adopting this officially. So all the due diligence has been followed, everybody's been notified. They've had an appeal period. So it's just like adopting new floodplains for an entire community to make these changes. So this is explaining what is required for these community driven changes. It's the same requirement, except you are, instead of just saying I have no impact on any of these BFEs, you're saying that I am not changing the water surface elevation by any more than a foot in the community. So it's the same requirement. You have to prove, just like you're doing a new study, you're essentially treating it like a new study where you have to meet the no more than 1 foot floodway analysis has been completed. But yeah, I think this is the exemption from the no rise thing, applying for essentially an exception to
And so it mentions
no
like
rise.
changing the floodway boundary, right? And so in the example you gave, were you actually changing the floodway boundary?
Yes, so you're changing the floodway
So
boundary, but
so wouldn't you have to go, and sorry if I'm confused, the only one confused here, but wouldn't you have to go through this iterative process if you're changing the boundary of a
yeah,
floodway?
it's the same process. But that's meeting the no rise requirements, so it wouldn't get
Okay.
you don't have to do this exception thing,
So as long as
because it's
so you can change the boundary as long as there's a no rise, but if there is a rise, then you have to go through this process. Is that my
yeah,
understanding? Okay. Okay.
yeah,
Thank you.
essentially this is I think this section is meant to detail the if you don't meet the no rise, um which it's saying is it's really kind of covering both, I guess, but because you have to go through the same process either way. But the only way you're getting the change in base flood elevations and actual like real change in the floodway and the actual profile and not following the no rise is going through this the community going through this exemption process.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, these documents aren't always super clear. They really, and it's on a little bit on purpose because they are trying to allow for flexibility. So they don't want to make the requirements so rigid that it's impossible to meet it in some situations. They want to allow, and that's, I think a lot of the changes coming down the pipe are allowing for more of that flexibility. And if we go into the far future, I have no idea how FFRD is going to impact these requirements. Like, I don't know how you can do a LOMR in a FFRD study area if that's the only study. Yeah, it's such a big process. So far future, these are going to change pretty drastically, but near future, they're just really trying to accommodate for a lot of different possibilities. Anything else relevant here? Well, this is actually alterations and relocations of a water course. So if you're actually moving a channel, this still requires. Oh, I skipped some chunks parts here. Here's, I guess this is more what I was talking about. There are limited situations where it's necessary to allow the development of floodway or floodplain that was real and base flood elevation greater than the generally allowed in FIP minimum criteria. Where there are situations where it may be in the public interest to allow this development if no existing buildings are impacted and future buildings are elevated. So if it's a general community good, I mean, if you're building a flood control dam for your community or something like that, it's going to change all of this. So there needs to be a way to move forward with those, or even, changing your dam to meet state criteria may require this stuff. So a net public benefit are what they're looking for. If there's exceptions for roads and bridges. If you're doing a bridge replacement through the floodplain, and it may increase the flood elevations, as long as that's not impacting any structures, insurable structures, and everybody that's impacted is okay with it, then that can be considered. There are exemptions for those types of situations. Kind of reading through this as I go, make sure I'm not missing anything important. This is just outlining the process for doing these types of exemptions. So they're gonna require a little bit more information, and the community is gonna have to be very involved with it to go through this process. Including evaluate alternatives that would meet the requirement. So if there's any feasible way possible that you do not cause a rise, then you have to prove that your way is better for whatever and give the reasons for it. So there's probably the main thing that you need to add to this. Because the notice to property owners and all this they're required no matter what you do. So you are under no obligation to request a floodway revision just because a developer wants one. It is your floodway. You can do what you want. And then this goes through the process of actually moving a channel. Of course, the most difficult part of this would be your 404 permitting. So if you can get through that process, then this part of it should be pretty easy. Comparatively. But there are still some items you need to check. They're not going to let you get away with making the channel smaller and increasing flooding on anybody. Essentially making you maintain the same flow capacity. And you're not negatively impacting anybody's property, any insurable structures. Little paragraph about CRS. And that's the end of that document. I think that is the main one that you will look at for LOMRs, or the main three that I went through there. Never wants to keep my same display. I want to also reset me here. I think we're all the way at the end here. So start typing any questions if you have any. I'll try to answer them best I can, or you can come off mute and actually ask. I think lessons learned here. Is that going to be my last section? So here's a little low adjacent grade determination. And we didn't actually we don't have a poll question for this. So we won't really quiz you on it, but where is the low adjacent grade for this property? This is a little bit of a trick question. But and I always you don't have all the details for this is why it's a little bit of a trick question, because like it almost looks like they built a basement under their trailer here, and if that's the case then it's down at A, but no, this is just like a retaining wall that a trailer is sitting on top of. So their first floor opening is up here at C, but the low adjacent grade would be here at B. But weird situations we run into. Okay, lessons learned. So filling out an MT2 application, I think the project narrative, background data, these are the most important things if you want to get through this process smoothly. Good detail in your project narrative, describing everything you did, giving justifications for all assumptions you made, Providing as much background data as possible will make this process go smoother. Make sure that you have actual communications with your reviewer. I mean, you can like use FEMA's help, talk to them, ask them exactly any doubts you have. It's worthwhile. And also be a good neighbor and make sure you're communicating with anybody impacted by these changes. Provide prompt responses to comments. So of course, the faster you respond to your comments, the faster the process will go. Even though you have 90 days, you don't need to take the 90 days. Everything you do will shorten up the total process. Anything you do quicker. Perform internal checks of NFIP regulatory mapping data. So making sure that everything is matching up, you have proper tie-ins, making sure you need to do all these checks before you make the reviewer do all these checks if you want to get through this process. Make sure you have all the community acknowledgement forms from all the jurisdictions that are impacted. You'll have to go through another round of review if you're missing one of those. And make sure that you have notified all impacted property owners and done your public notice. Things that are commonly overlooked. Non-compliant models or methodology, make sure you're following that guidance that I showed you, hydrology and hydraulics guidance, that the models and methodology you are using falls under those guidance documents, and make sure that you're using, if it's available, using the effective model, and you just modify the effective model is the best way to do it. That's what FEMA wants to see. Check your datum conversions. Always check your datum conversions, and then check them again just to make sure. Make sure you're providing all the background data, if they don't have some of the information, you didn't submit it with it, that's going to slow the review process down. If they have to request it, that's going to extend your review time. Or any missing the work map, missing any crucial required information. As you're going through those forms, you saw they had all those check boxes to reminders of everything that you need to include. Check and double check. There's a reason they put that in there, because it's often missed. There again, floodplain does not tie into the effective floodplain. Make sure that you're tying in at your upstream and downstream limits. And make sure your no rise certification is correct. And make sure you have the no rise certification if you're doing anything in the floodway. And with that, does anybody have any questions?
While you guys are thinking of questions, I'll bring up the final poll question. And this one's pretty simple. This one is just, if you guys want the continuing education credits for this training, please check yes. And it'll probably take me about a week to get those out, but I'll send those out, and I'll also send out the link to the recording as well as the slides from today. Okay.
Last call for questions.
Yeah, last call for questions. If not, thank you guys for spending your morning with us. I hope you found this valuable. I'll also send out a link to a follow-up survey just so we can see how we can improve these moving forward.